The first time I saw Sarah, she was standing in the middle of a crowded cafe, her laughter cutting through the noise like sunlight piercing through a cloudy day. Her blonde hair fell loosely over her shoulders, framing a face so full of life that it seemed impossible to look away. I wasn't supposed to be there that evening. A cancelled meeting had left me wandering the streets of our small town, and something about the warmth of the cafe lights had drawn me inside. Fate, perhaps. She wasn't alone. 2 friends flanked her, both talking animatedly, but it was Sarah who held the room. There was an ease about her, the kind that only comes from someone entirely at home in their own skin. When she glanced in my direction, her eyes lingered for a moment longer than I expected, and a small, curious smile played on her lips. That was all it took. "Excuse me, do you mind if I join you?" I said, half joking, as I approached her table with a courage I didn't know I had. Her friends exchanged amused glances, but Sarah tilted her head, considering me. "That depends," she said, her voice as warm as honey. "Do you drink coffee or tea?" "Coffee," I replied without hesitation, though I couldn't care less about what was in my cup at that moment. "Good answer," she said with a laugh, gesturing for me to sit. That evening, we talked until the cafe staff started flipping chairs onto tables. I learned that Sarah had grown up just a few towns over, loved hiking more than anything, and had a habit of scribbling poetry in the margins of old books. She listened with genuine interest as I told her about my job at the local hardware store, the guitar lessons I'd been taking for years but still couldn't master, and my dream of one day opening a music shop. Before we parted, she tucked a napkin into my hand, her number scrawled across it in looping, confident handwriting. "Call me," she said, and then she was gone, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with a grin I couldn't shake. Over the months that followed, Sarah became my everything. Our dates were never extravagant, but they were perfect. We'd hike up to the hills overlooking the town, her backpack always filled with sandwiches and thermoses of hot chocolate. On rainy days, we'd stay in, watching old movies and laughing until our sides ached. She had a way of making even the mundane feel magical. It wasn't long before I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. Proposing wasn't a grand affair. It happened one quiet evening as we sat on my couch, her head resting on my shoulder. I pulled out a small velvet box and simply said, "Sarah, I can't imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Her answer came with a tearful smile and a kiss that promised forever. Our wedding was as small as our town. Friends and family gathered in the garden behind Sarah's parents' house, string lights casting a warm glow as the sun dipped below the horizon. She walked down the aisle in a dress she'd found at a thrift store and altered herself, looking like something out of a dream. I can still hear the sound of her laughter as we danced under the stars, the rest of the world fading into nothingness. In those early years, life was simple but full. We moved into a cozy little house on Maple Street, painted the walls together, and filled the rooms with second-hand furniture and shared memories. I'd wake up every morning to the sight of her beside me, her hair a wild mess and her smile sleepy but real. It was more than I'd ever dared to hope for. I didn't know then how fragile happiness could be, or how quickly the foundation of a life built together could begin to crack. In those days, I thought love was enough to weather anything. But life, I would learn, has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. Our life together felt like a perfectly composed song. Each day had its rhythm, its melody, and Sarah was the harmony that brought everything together. She had this knack for turning even the dullest moments into something worth remembering. The way she'd hum old jazz tunes while washing dishes or sneak tiny notes into my lunch bag, each one signed with a doodled heart. I'd always smile like a fool when I found them. We weren't rich, but we didn't need to be. Our home was small but warm, filled with mismatched furniture and the scent of fresh brewed coffee that Sarah loved so much. A gallery of framed photos lined the walls, a montage of road trips, birthdays, and lazy Sundays. There was one photo, though, that always caught my eye, Sarah sitting cross-legged on a beach towel, her golden hair illuminated by the late afternoon sun. Her smile was so genuine, so full of life. That was who Sarah was to me, sunlight in human form. Looking back, those were the golden years. Our traditions made life feel special, even in its simplicity. Every Saturday morning, we'd head to the local farmer's market. Sarah would linger at the flower stalls, always choosing the brightest sunflowers. These, she'd say, holding them up for my approval, are the secret to a happy home. Sunday afternoons were reserved for hiking. Sarah had a favorite trail just outside of town, one that led to a quiet clearing with a view of the valley below. We'd sit there for hours, talking about everything and nothing, dreaming up future plans. One day, she'd say, tracing shapes in the sky, we'll travel the world. Italy first. Then Greece. And maybe Japan. I'd nod, happy just to dream with her, even if our finances meant those dreams were distant ones. I remember the day we bought our house like it was yesterday. It was far from perfect, peeling wallpaper in the living room, a leaky faucet in the kitchen, and floors that creaked with every step. But to us, it was a blank canvas. Sarah and I spent that first month working side by side to make it our own. Do you think we're crazy for taking this on? I asked one evening as we stood in the middle of the living room, paint rollers in hand. The walls were half covered in a soft shade of blue that Sarah had insisted on, claiming it would make the room feel like a summer sky. We're not crazy, she said with a grin, a smudge of paint on her cheek. We're adventurous. There's a difference. We spent late nights scraping old wallpaper, arguing over furniture arrangements, and laughing when things didn't go as planned. Once, while trying to fix the faucet, I accidentally turned the water on full blast, soaking us both. Sarah doubled over with laughter, clutching her stomach as water pooled on the kitchen floor. Ethan, she gasped between fits of laughter, if this house doesn't kill us, we're going to live here forever. In those moments, it felt like we were building more than a home. We were building a life, a future. And yet, even then, there were fleeting conversations that hinted at the fears we both carried. One night, as we lay on the floor of the freshly painted bedroom, exhausted but content, Sarah asked me, "What's your biggest fear?" The question caught me off guard. "I don't know," I said, staring at the ceiling. "Maybe failing. Not being able to give you the life you deserve." She propped herself up on one elbow, her face serious. "Ethan, you already give me more than I could ever want. You don't have to be perfect." "What about you?" I asked, eager to shift the focus away from myself. "What scares you?" Her gaze drifted to the window, her expression thoughtful. "Being forgotten," she said softly. "Living a life that doesn't matter, that no one remembers." I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "That's never going to happen, Sarah. You're unforgettable." She smiled, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a doubt, perhaps, or a sadness I didn't fully understand. At the time, I didn't press her. Maybe I should have. Our 5th anniversary was one of those rare moments when life felt too good to be true. I had saved up for months to surprise Sarah with a weekend getaway to a little cabin by the lake. When I told her about it, she looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes and threw her arms around me. "Ethan, you're too good to me," she whispered. The cabin was everything we needed, quiet, cozy, and surrounded by the kind of stillness you can only find in nature. We spent our days fishing off the dock, though Sarah was more interested in watching the fish than catching them. At night, we sat by the fireplace, sipping wine and talking about the past, the present, the future. "I want to grow old with you here," Sarah said one night, her head resting on my shoulder. "Just you and me, sitting by this fire, watching the seasons change." "You've got yourself a deal," I replied, kissing the top of her head. Looking back now, I can't help but wonder if those moments were too perfect, too fleeting, like a photograph that fades with time. Sarah started changing not long after that anniversary. It was subtle at first, a new hobby here, a little less time spent at home there. She joined a local hiking club and began taking trips with them almost every weekend. "You should come with me sometime," she'd say, but her smile never quite reached her eyes. I didn't think much of it then. I wanted her to have her independence, to find joy in her own pursuits. After all, isn't that what love is? Letting someone grow? But as the months passed, the distance between us grew too, like a shadow creeping across the floor at sunset. It was small things at first. She'd come home later than usual, her cheeks flushed and her stories full of people I didn't know. "Josh said the funniest thing today," she'd begin, or, "You'd love hiking with Mandy and the crew." Josh, Mandy, the crew. Names that started to feel like strangers intruding into our home. I told myself it was normal, that every relationship ebbs and flows. But a part of me, the part that had built my life around Sarah, couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away. I just didn't know how much. Not yet. It started with a pair of hiking boots. They were expensive, the kind of gear Sarah never used to care about. She brought them home one evening, placing the box on the kitchen counter with a grin. "Look at these beauties," she said, pulling out one boot and inspecting it like it was a rare treasure. "They're supposed to be perfect for long trails." "They're nice," I said, though I couldn't hide my surprise. Sarah had always been more about the experience than the gear. "What happened to your old ones?" "They're worn out," she replied casually, her attention already elsewhere. At first, I didn't think much of it. She'd been hiking more lately, often with her new club, and I figured she just needed better equipment. But it wasn't just the boots. There were new jackets, backpacks, and water bottles, small things that slowly replaced the familiar ones we used to share. And then there were the weekends. Sarah had always loved hiking, but now it was every Saturday, sometimes Sundays too. "You should come with us," she'd say, her tone light, almost dismissive. "You'd love the group. They're great people." I'd nod, offering a non-committal. "Maybe next time." But we both knew it wouldn't happen. I wasn't a part of that world, and for the first time, I felt like an outsider looking in. It wasn't until the second camping trip that I started to feel uneasy. Sarah had never been much of a camper. She loved the outdoors but always preferred the comfort of a warm bed at the end of the day. Yet here she was, packing for a weekend under the stars with her hiking friends. "Who's going this time?" I asked as she folded clothes into her bag. "Oh, the usual crew," she replied, not looking up. "Josh, Mandy, a couple of new people." Josh again. That name had been coming up more and more lately. "You seem to talk about Josh a lot," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. Sarah paused, her hands hovering over her bag. "He's just a friend, Ethan. We all get along really well." I nodded, forcing a smile, but the knot in my stomach tightened. Something about the way she said it, so matter-of-fact, so rehearsed, made it hard to believe. The weekend was long. Too long. I kept busy around the house, tackling the little projects Sarah and I had been putting off, fixing the squeaky door, replacing the leaky faucet in the bathroom. But the house felt emptier without her. Each creak and groan of the old floors seemed louder, more unsettling. Sunday evening, she came home, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly tousled. She looked happy, more alive than I'd seen her in weeks. "How was it?" I asked, meeting her in the hallway as she set down her bag. "Amazing," she said, her smile wide. "The views were incredible. I wish you could have been there." She stepped closer, kissing me on the cheek before disappearing into the bedroom to unpack. I stood there for a moment, staring at the spot where she'd been, wondering why her happiness felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. The following weeks brought more of the same. Sarah's weekends were increasingly filled with trips, meetings, and casual outings with the group. Our once familiar routines began to unravel. Movie nights turned into evenings spent alone on the couch, her laughter replaced by the faint hum of the television. Even our dinners felt different, conversations that once flowed easily now stalled, filled with pauses too heavy to ignore. One evening, as we sat at the table picking at our food, I decided to ask. "Are we okay?" I said, my voice breaking the silence. Sarah looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. You've just been so distant lately. Like you're here, but not really here." She sighed, setting her fork down. "Ethan, it's not like that. I've just been busy. The hikes, the group, they've been a good distraction, you know? Life gets routine, and sometimes you need a change." Her words stung more than I expected. Routine. Was that what we had become? I wanted to argue, to tell her that our life wasn't routine, that it was ours, built on love and shared dreams. But the look in her eyes stopped me. She didn't want to fight. She wanted space. So I gave it to her. Looking back, I wonder if that was my mistake. Maybe I should have fought harder, should have pulled her closer instead of letting her drift away. But at the time, I told myself that love meant letting her find her own way, even if that way didn't include me. It wasn't until much later that I realized how far she had already gone. The first undeniable sign came one Thursday evening. I had come home earlier than usual, hoping to surprise Sarah with takeout from her favorite Thai place. The house was quiet when I walked in, the kind of silence that feels heavier than it should. I called out her name, but there was no answer. I placed the food on the kitchen counter and was about to head to the bedroom when I noticed her phone on the table. Sarah was careful with her phone, rarely leaving it out of reach. It wasn't locked. She must have stepped away mid-text, the screen still glowing. I didn't mean to look. I told myself it was wrong, that everyone deserves their privacy. But something about the text on the screen froze me in place. It was from someone named Josh. Can't stop thinking about last weekend. When can I see you again? My heart sank. The words blurred as I stared at them, trying to convince myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was innocent. Maybe it was a joke. But deep down I knew. The sound of the front door opening snapped me out of my trance. Sarah walked in, her hair slightly damp from the rain, and froze when she saw me standing there. "Ethan," she said, her voice tinged with surprise and something else, fear maybe. Her eyes flicked to the table, to her phone. I stepped aside, gesturing to it. "Josh can't stop thinking about last weekend," I said, my voice low but steady. "What's that about?" For a moment she said nothing, her face pale. Then she sighed, setting her bag down. "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I said, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Because it looks a hell of a lot like you're having an affair." Her silence said more than any words could. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if searching for the right lie but coming up empty. "It's complicated," she finally said. "No," I snapped. "It's simple. Either you're cheating on me or you're not." She looked down, unable to meet my eyes. That was all the confirmation I needed. The days that followed were a blur. Sarah moved into the guest room, claiming she needed space to think. I didn't argue. I was too drained to fight. Every conversation felt like walking through a minefield, each word threatening to ignite another explosion. I replayed every moment in my head, searching for signs I might have missed. The late nights, the hiking trips, the distant look in her eyes, how had I let it get this far without seeing the truth? But the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was the questions that came with it. Why wasn't I enough? What had I done, or failed to do, that pushed her away? The doubts ate at me, each one more painful than the last. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I knocked on the door of the guest room, and when Sarah opened it, she looked as tired as I felt. "We need to talk," I said. She nodded, stepping aside to let me in. The room felt foreign, like it belonged to a stranger. "I need to know why," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why him? Why now?" She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know," she said after a long pause. "It just happened." "That's not good enough," I said, my frustration boiling over. "We built a life together, Sarah. You don't just throw that away because something happened." Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt or self-pity. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," she said. "I swear I wasn't." "Well, congratulations," I said bitterly. "You succeeded anyway." We sat in silence, the weight of unspoken words suffocating. Finally, Sarah looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I don't know how we got here, Ethan. I don't know how to fix this." Neither did I. That night, I slept on the couch, though sleep didn't come easily. I stared at the ceiling, replaying her words over and over. She didn't know how to fix this. Did that mean she wanted to? Did I? The next morning, Sarah was gone before I woke up, a note on the counter saying she needed time to clear her head. I stared at it for what felt like hours, the words blurring as tears filled my eyes. For the first time, I wondered if love alone was enough to save us, or if it ever had been. The decision to follow Sarah wasn't planned. It happened on a whim, spurred by a gnawing curiosity and an ache I couldn't shake. She'd mentioned heading out for another group meeting, her tone casual, almost dismissive. But something about the way she avoided eye contact, the way her voice faltered, made my stomach churn. That evening, I got into my car and drove to the trailhead parking lot where she said they'd meet. Her car was there, parked neatly among a row of others, but something felt off. I waited, the minutes crawling by, until I saw her and Josh emerge, not from the trail but from a side path that led toward town. They were laughing, walking side by side as if the world didn't exist around them. He leaned in close, his hand brushing against her back, and my heart clenched. I followed them at a distance, my grip on the steering wheel tightening with every turn they took. They stopped at a small cafe, the kind we used to visit together. I parked across the street, my view partially obscured by a row of cars, but I could still see them through the window. They chose a table near the back, leaning in toward each other, as if sharing secrets meant for no one else. I didn't know how long I sat there, frozen, torn between disbelief and rage. Finally, I got out of the car and crossed the street, my legs moving on autopilot. The bell above the cafe door jingled as I entered, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Josh and Sarah looked up simultaneously, their faces betraying the shock they couldn't hide. "Ethan," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. My eyes shifted to Josh, who looked uncomfortable but didn't back down. "This is your group meeting?" Josh cleared his throat, standing as well. "Look, man, I think we should talk." "No," I snapped, my gaze locking onto Sarah. "I want to hear it from her." Sarah hesitated, glancing between Josh and me. "It's not what it looks like," she began, but I cut her off. "Don't," I said, my voice rising slightly. "Don't insult me by pretending this is nothing. I saw the texts, Sarah. I followed you. Just tell me the truth." Her shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw guilt in her eyes. "It's not serious, Ethan. He's just a friend. I didn't mean for it to get this far." "Not serious?" I echoed, my disbelief turning to anger. "You've been sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, and it's not serious?" "I didn't feel seen," she blurted out, her voice breaking. "You've been so wrapped up in your routines, in your own world. I felt like I was fading away." I stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "So instead of talking to me, you turned to him?" I asked, pointing at Josh, who remained silent. "I didn't plan this," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It just happened. He made me feel alive again." "Alive?" I said, my voice rising. "And what about me, Sarah? What about the life we built together? Does that mean nothing to you?" She sobbed quietly, unable to answer. I turned to Josh, who had been standing silently, his expression unreadable. "And you?" I said, stepping closer. "What the hell are you doing getting involved with a married woman?" Josh held up his hands defensively. "Look, Ethan, I didn't go looking for this. I didn't even know she was married at first." "And when you found out?" I demanded. "You just decided it didn't matter?" Josh sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I care about Sarah," he admitted. "But I'm not looking for anything long-term. I told her that from the beginning." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. He didn't even want her. She had risked everything for, what? A fling? Attention? The realization burned. "So you're just going to use her and throw her away?" I asked, my voice shaking with anger. I didn't force her into this, Josh said firmly. She made her own choices. Choices? I scoffed, turning back to Sarah. Is that true? Is this what you chose? She didn't answer, her silence louder than any words could have been. I left the cafe without another word, the bell above the door ringing hollow in my ears. The cool evening air hit me like a wave, but it did nothing to calm the storm inside me. My mind raced, replaying their words, their faces, their betrayal. That night, I sat alone in our house, staring at the framed photos on the wall. Each one felt like a mockery now, a reminder of a life that was slipping through my fingers. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. The days following the confrontation at the cafe were a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, but beneath it all, a faint, stubborn thread of love remained. Despite everything, I couldn't imagine a life without Sarah. The pain was sharp and real, but so was the history we shared. Sarah stayed with her sister for a few days, giving us both the space we desperately needed. The house felt emptier than ever without her. Every corner, every photo on the wall seemed to echo with memories of better times. As much as I tried to distract myself, fixing things around the house, working late hours, it was impossible to escape the weight of her absence. On the third night, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Sarah standing there, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She clutched a small bag in her hands, as if unsure if she was welcome. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. She sat on the couch, her movements hesitant, and I took the chair across from her, keeping a deliberate distance. "I don't know where to start," she said, her voice trembling. "I messed up, Ethan. I know I did. And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." I stayed silent, letting her speak. She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. "I felt lost," she continued. "Not because of you, but because of me. I was scared of fading, of becoming someone who didn't matter. And when Josh came along, he gave me the attention I didn't know I was craving. But it was never about love. It was about feeling seen." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. "I know that's not an excuse," she said, looking up at me with tears in her eyes. "You didn't deserve this. You've always been good to me, Ethan. Better than I probably deserve. And if I could take it all back, I would." I leaned back in my chair, the anger I'd been holding on to softening just enough for her words to sink in. "Why didn't you tell me how you were feeling?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "Why didn't you come to me instead of him?" "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid you wouldn't understand. Afraid you'd think I was being selfish or ungrateful. And by the time I realized how far I'd let things go, I didn't know how to stop." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her confession settling between us. "I'm not perfect either," I said finally, surprising even myself. "Maybe I got too comfortable, too caught up in routines. Maybe I didn't notice the ways you were slipping away. But Sarah, I never stopped loving you." Her breath hitched, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. "I love you too, Ethan. I never stopped. And I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, if you'll let me." I stood, walking over to sit beside her on the couch. For the first time in weeks, I saw the Sarah I fell in love with, the vulnerability in her eyes, the sincerity in her voice. I reached for her hand, and she gripped it tightly, as if afraid to let go. "This isn't going to be easy," I said. "Trust takes time to rebuild. And I need to know you're willing to put in the work." "I am," she said without hesitation. "I'll do anything, Ethan. Just tell me where to start." The weeks that followed were far from perfect, but they were a beginning. We started seeing a counselor, something I never thought we'd do but quickly realized we needed. The sessions were hard, forcing us to confront truths we'd both been avoiding, but they also gave us tools to rebuild what had been broken. Sarah quit the hiking group, distancing herself from Josh and the world that had come between us. I made an effort to be more present, to pay attention to the little things that mattered to her. We began setting aside time for each other, quiet evenings without distractions, weekend getaways to reconnect. One night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Sarah turned to me, her expression soft. "Do you think we'll be okay?" she asked. I looked at her, the woman who had hurt me but also the woman I had chosen to love. "I think we will," I said. "As long as we keep choosing each other." She smiled, leaning her head against my shoulder. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope, not for what we had been, but for what we could still become.